So what about your main concern? What about education? And I'm sure you've already been connecting the dots, but let me connect them a little more explicitly. Let's start by looking at the United States, which I believe is always an early warning signal for what can happen. Yeah. Over the last 30 years, public schools in that country, especially in inner city and poor districts, have been starved of adequate funding. They've deteriorated as a result, and nobody denies that the system is in crisis and has been in crisis, especially in the inner cities for some time. But when you listen to school reform advocates in the United States, including many allegedly progressive ones, the reasons behind this crisis are not chronic underfunding and neglect. The reasons are unaccountable teachers and their unions. And if you listen a bit further, the solution proposed is to make schools run more like businesses and to ensure that more schools are actually run by businesses. In the spring of 2008, a symposium is held at Chicago's exclusive Mid-America Club to celebrate the first 3 years of a program in that city to revamp and reform the entire school system called Renaissance 2010. The name of the symposium, Free to Choose, Free to Succeed, the New Market of Public Education, captured its animating idea that public schooling should be governed by private sector values and private sector goals. Arne Duncan, then the head of the Chicago school system, and he had recently changed his position title from school superintendent to CEO. Arne Duncan was the symposium star attraction. We're trying to blur the lines between the public and the private, he told the audience. I am not a manager of 600 schools, he said. I'm a portfolio manager of 600 schools, and I'm trying to improve the portfolio. Now, while Duncan had overseen Renaissance 2010, he had delegated the actual detailed drafting of the plan to the Commercial Club of Chicago, which is just astounding, which is the voice of the city's business elite. And that organization had put together the plan, and they had openly declared in putting it together that its intention was nothing short of reshaping Chicago's school system to reflect a, quote, private sector perspective. 60 schools were closed down, 100 new ones were opened in their place. The new ones were all run by private operators, including for-profit corporations, and unlike the schools they replaced, not one of them had a union. And the public school closings continue today, as we speak, with 50 more schools targeted for closure just last month, and again, these likely to be replaced by privately run schools. Now, the overarching effect of what's happening in the city of Chicago is to transform a quintessentially public institution, public schooling, into a market-driven partnership with business. And that approach has effectively become, it's not confined to Chicago, it's become the model for school reform in the United States. It's being touted by many, again, many progressive reformers as the way forward. And indeed, President Obama's national education policy, Race to the Top, incorporates most of the key elements from Chicago's Renaissance 2010. Put them side by side. I'm not making this up. And it really should come as no surprise. Why? Because the person that President Obama chose as his Secretary of Education when he was first elected, and who continues in that position today, is none other than the architect of Chicago's school privatization plan, Arne Duncan. Now, what's going on in U.S. schools is a classic privatization story. Tax cuts and undertaxation of business and wealth lead to revenue crunches. Revenue crunches lead to underfunding of schools. Underfunding creates intolerable conditions, and inevitably schools struggle and fail. But it's not inadequate funding that's blamed, it's teachers and their unions. And it's not better funding that's proposed, it's privatization. More industry and corporate involvement, more market-driven incentives and sanctions. And not surprisingly, the main backers of all of this come from the ranks of big business. None other than Bill Gates is currently at the helm of the school reform movement in the United States. And the reality is that there are massive amounts of money to be made by for-profit corporations in an area, public schooling, that historically they've been closed out of. And they now want a piece of it. Actually, they now want all of it. One of the people I interviewed in making the corporation film was Benno Schmidt, who is a sort of high-ranking player in the emerging education industry in the United States, a former president of Yale University. And unimaginably vast is how he described the potential for this new market in education. Education is bigger, he said, than defense. And he was kind of, his hands, rubbing his hands in glee as he said this. Education is bigger than defense, bigger than the whole domestic auto industry. Only healthcare has a larger segment of the American marketplace, he said. And corporations are working hard now to tap that new profit potential. More schools are being run by publicly traded for-profit companies known as EMOs, like HMOs, education management companies. More schools are being transformed into what are called career academies, partnerships with industry where students are trained to become low-skill, low-wage workers. For-profit companies are playing increasing roles in training teachers, in providing standardized tests and curricula, in providing food, janitorial, security services. It's no exaggeration to say that corporations are on their way, and this is clearly what Benno Schmidt and his education industry colleagues want. They're clearly on their way to taking over the public education system in the United States, with the complicity, indeed with the blessing, of federal, state, and municipal governments. And while many teachers and unions are courageously fighting the trend, they are facing unprecedented and often vitriolic vilification and blame for the system's failings, especially by the likes of Fox News, and other various privatization zealots. And they are facing, it's not just rhetoric they're facing, they are facing an epidemic of mass firings, as districts and states, prodded on by Obama's race to the top, increasingly resort to firing the entire teaching staffs of struggling schools. Hundreds of teachers fired in Chicago and in Florida in just the last few months, and they're fired en masse. Before that, hundreds fired in Washington, D.C. New laws are coming into place in various states, including New York State, that say if a school is not performing well, it has to be closed, all of its teachers fired, and then reopened and run by private organizations. So it's quite incredible what's going on. Blaming teachers has become the driving and justifying idea behind privatization and corporatization in the U.S., which of course conveniently obscures the real reasons behind schools' difficulties. Chronic underfunding that leads to crowded classrooms, deteriorated buildings, too few teachers, poor materials and outdated textbooks. Chronic poverty that deprives students stable homes and good nutrition, fosters violence and hopelessness, and in these ways saps students of their focus, of their energy, of their motivation, of their health, of their self-esteem. When schools operate in these kinds of conditions, underfunded, and in impoverished, dysfunctional communities, when schools operate in these kinds of conditions, it is difficult, if not impossible, for teachers to teach and students to learn. Yet, it's teachers that are blamed. Blamed for these conditions and outcomes that they are neither responsible for nor able to control or change. And those who should be blamed, who should be held accountable, the business and political elites that neglect public interests and that hijack public policy to serve their own interests, they just slip out the back door behind the chorus of teacher blaming and scamper from view.